And if we have time, we'll backtrack to Lamentations. All right, since we didn't have a chance to do that last week. But I want to do Ezekiel tonight since that's where the schedule places us. And when I get my computer back, I'll type these notes up for you. It's broken right now. And I've been waiting for it for a week in the shop. So, the book of Ezekiel, one of the more mysterious books in the Bible. What did you say?
You're not doing Lamentations?
No, I said Ezekiel.
So I just thought of that.
No. I can tell where he was 2 minutes ago. No, I just said that I was going to backtrack and we got to that Ezekiel. Yeah, too much supper, right?
No, I caught a weasel in my ring when I was trying to get him out.
Try to use me for a bit roller.
Try to.
I don't like boring classes, so this is great. But it would be nice to be able to make progress.
Don't worry about it.
It's up to you.
Okay, all right. So the title of the book of Ezekiel is Ezekiel. Yeah. It's a good place to start. And it comes from the Hebrew word. Pardon? Oh, I did. No.
We got the first instead.
We don't have to tape it for Tracy because she's here in Boston.
Very good. Okay, good.
Well.
Very well.
The title of the book of Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible is exactly the same as it is in English, only in the Hebrew language. The Hebrew word Yehezkel, which is found in the first verse rather, means God strengthens. God strengthens, or God will strengthen. It came to pass. Actually, it's found in the third verse, I'm sorry. The word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel the priest, the son of Uzai or Buzai, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar. Not much else to say about the title. Now, the author and the date of writing. As you would imagine, the traditional view of the authorship of the book of Ezekiel is that Ezekiel wrote it. This has been the unquestioned Jewish and Christian tradition as far back as the 2nd century BC. Are you familiar with approximately when Ezekiel would have lived? There's a key date that we talked about last week in our discussion of the book of Jeremiah. When was the Battle of Carchemish?
604.
I think 604, 605, something like that. What happened at the Battle of Carchemish?
Change in power between Egypt and Babylon.
Right. And who won?
Babylon.
Right. So the dominance in world supremacy shifted from Egypt, which was south of the land of Palestine, to the northeast of Palestine, or Babylonia, or Chaldea, as it's also known, with that battle on the Euphrates River. Now, 605 was the very year that King Nebuchadnezzar came down into this formerly Egyptian territory called Palestine. See, up until that time, Egypt had controlled that part of the country. It was really annexed to Egypt. It was the kings of Israel were forced to to pay tribute on at least 2 occasions to the Egyptian pharaohs. All right. So in 605, since the Babylonians won, well, this gave the green light to Nebuchadnezzar to come down into this territory that had formerly belonged to the Egyptians and to plunder it. And that's precisely what happened. He went as far as Jerusalem in 605 BC. After Carchemish, he came down to Jerusalem. He plundered the city. And he left the city of Jerusalem in 605 upon hearing word via messenger from Babylon that his father, whose name was Nabopolassar, had died. All right? You follow the story now. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar is the king's son. He's the general of the army, the Babylonian army. So he comes down to Jerusalem, sacks it in 605, and then takes a few captives with him and left the prophet Jeremiah in the town. And returned to Babylon. Before he left Jerusalem, he left a puppet king on the throne by the name of Jehoiakim, K-I-M. He was a Jew, and he put him on the throne. What? I think so. And that man rebelled in about 3 years' time. So Nebuchadnezzar returned, took Jehoiakim in chains back to Babylon, and installed his, I think it's his son, on the throne. Jehoiakim was just a kid, 18 years of age. And within 3 months, Nebuchadnezzar was forced to come all the way back from Babylon to Jerusalem. And you can imagine how happy he was. It's a 900-mile trip, one way. 3 months later, he's forced to come back that 900 miles from Babylon because Jehoiakim has shown himself an unfitting vassal king. And this time, they completely demolished the city of Jerusalem, as Jeremiah had predicted. And while all this is taking place, Ezekiel is up in the land of Babylon as one of these exiles. And he is a prophet of God at the same time that Jeremiah is down in Palestine as a prophet of God. And at the same time as who's other king? Daniel and Ezekiel lived in Babylon at the same time. Right? They were both prophets. Jeremiah was prophesying in Jerusalem. Now this is the background to the authorship and the David writing part that we're discussing. Right? And so Ezekiel began to prophesy a few years after Jerusalem was, or a few years after King Jehoiakim was taken in that first deportation. All right? 597 BC. Or in the second deportation, 597 BC. So he began to prophesy about 593. So if you want the date of writing, this book came actually out of Babylon. This is where it was written. See, the book of Ezekiel was written in Babylon by a Jewish prophet who was an exile with all the other exiles. About the same time that Daniel was a young man and rising to prominence within the political arena. This man was just a lowly slave. And Ezekiel prophesied from that 593 to 559 BC. And the reason we can pinpoint with such accuracy the date in which Ezekiel prophesied is because he himself dates his own predictions, and that's precisely what your assignment is for the book of Ezekiel. I want you to familiarize yourself by drawing a timeline and going through the book of Ezekiel and pinpointing all those points at various times in chronological order in which Ezekiel said on his first one began on the 30th year, and the 4th month, and the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river of Chebar, the heavens were opened, I saw visions of God in the 5th day of the month, which is the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. He identifies it very specifically, down to the day. And from that point on, whenever God showed him a vision, then he would pinpoint it down. Okay? So that's what I want you to do for your assignment, to break down this period of time in which Ezekiel prophesied. Familiarize yourself with those and put it on a timeline. It makes for interesting Bible studies when you're looking for something. Okay? So that's how I want you to familiarize yourself with the book of Ezekiel. So the prophet Ezekiel has been held by Jewish and Christian tradition to have prophesied from 593 to 559 BC. He was captivated in 597 to Babylon. Now, I should mention in passing, just for your own familiarity, that the liberal critics out of Germany and hence to the rest of the Western world have, for many years in the 1900s, rejected, I don't know the proper word, Ezekiel or Ezekielian, but as Ezekiel being the author of this book. They have rejected the tradition. There are about 3 varying views. You might as well write them down, just out of familiarity. So this is the critical view of the authorship of the book of Ezekiel. One group of critics say that Ezekiel was written by an unknown author about 230 BC. Another group of scholars believes that the book of Ezekiel is the work of an unknown editor about 200 BC. The first view is that it was probably written by some individual, 230 BC. The second view is that there was somebody that edited a number of traditions and put it into its present form, 200 BC. That's another view. A third view is that the book was written in Palestine after the days of Nehemiah, about 400 BC. Okay. In Palestine, after the days of Nehemiah, about 400 BC. Question? Can anybody imagine what would be the reason that the critics would place dates like this for the writing of the book of Ezekiel? What are the presupposition of people that reject what the Bible plainly says and replace that with some other very imaginative view? On what assumptions are they working? We've heard this before, but you need to familiarize yourself with it.
It's not pathetic. It's happening according to the time, and it must have been such according to tradition, according to order, Jewish religion.
Okay, so what would cause a person to believe that, though? From the Christian perspective, it is.
Well,
But
from their perspective, they can't be God, therefore it has to exist according to this pattern. It can't be done in any way.
So, in other words, they're operating on the assumption that there is no such thing as the miraculous. Right? People who don't believe in miracles don't believe in predictive prophecy, right? That there is such a thing as a prediction. Right?
Yeah, but you say this would mean the Christians are more liberal theologians.
Yeah, but that doesn't make them Christian.
I know that, but you just over and over and over.
To us, it seems absurd because we can see the inconsistency of calling yourself a Christian but not believing what the Bible says. For people back in the 1900s who were first hammering out the relationship between Christianity and modern science, post-Darwin, with his evolutionary theory. They had real problems trying to fit it together. So I believe many people were genuine Christians, but they accepted a worldview that was false in some respects, and they tried to merge the two together. And this is the kind of result you get. You believe them. I'm sure that many of these people were probably godly people, but they just had really bad views, really erroneous and inconsistent with. They would believe what the Bible literally says about salvation, about Christ, but they would deny the historical and scientific aspect. We see that as inconsistent. So that's where the critics are coming from. Okay? These critical viewpoints come from after about 1924, for example. Okay? I'll read you a quotation from Unger, Merrill F. Unger, in his Introductory Guide to the Old Testament, that sort of puts in a nutshell why we as conservative Christians believe that Ezekiel did write the book and the critics are wrong. He says, the evident arrangement and the plan and the careful and correct dating of the prophecies, the use of the first person in the book itself, plus the clear-cut purpose all point to the traditional view that Ezekiel himself composed the entire book. There's no reason he is inferring that we should deny that the man who says, I saw this, actually experienced this and wrote it down. There's no good reason why it couldn't have taken place. Okay? You don't have to say that about that unless you have questions. What's the purpose of the book of Ezekiel? Why is it in the Bible? What was his reason for preaching? What was he aiming at? Well, we can summarize the purposes of Ezekiel in 2 or 3 points. Number 1, Ezekiel was attempting to keep before the generation that was born in exile. He was attempting to keep before the generation born in exile the national sins which had brought about the exile. Probably one of the key verses to the book illustrates this point. And I'll read chapter 14, verse 23. This is God speaking, and Ezekiel was to pass it on. He says, they shall comfort you when you shall see their ways and their doings, and you, referring to the exiles, shall know that I, the Lord, that is, have not done without cause all that I have done in it, that is, in this judgment, saith the Lord God. God wanted them to know that what he had done was for a reason. And so he's passing this information on to Ezekiel to pass on to the exiles. Because how long were they there? How long was the Babylonian exile? 70 years. Well, 70 years is a long enough time for children to be born, to grow up. See? And some of them would have never even known what Jerusalem was like. And it would have been very easy for them to take the easy route out, just as it is in our society, for kids to forget what their Christian parents had taught them and to just mold themselves into the everyday society. It's very easy without someone reminding them of the way it really is to do that. So, one of Ezekiel's main jobs was to preach to the exiles, to keep reminding them why they were there. And that was because of their sin. A second major purpose was to sustain the faith of the exiles. To sustain the faith of the exiles. Now, Ezekiel did this 3 ways. The only way he could comfort them and hope to build up their faith in God and keep them on track while they were separated and under judgment was to remind them, to predict for them various things. Number one, that the nation would be restored. This is one of the main themes you find in the book. We'll touch on this later. But he sustained their faith by predicting many times that God would what's the word I'm looking for? Bring the people back to their land. Right? Regather or deliver them from their enemies. Secondly, he also predicted that God would execute justice on the very oppressors, that God was going to judge Babylon and Egypt and all their enemies. Sounds like Jeremiah, doesn't it? Almost identical. Well, these 2 books are almost identical.
It has to come to pass because Jeremiah.
And thirdly, Ezekiel predicted that someday the nation would be a glorious, independent nation once again. I suppose it's important to add to this that Ezekiel's purpose was not to preach economic, political reform as Isaiah and Jeremiah had done. Jeremiah, remember, was very frequently in the court of the king of Israel, of Judah. Remember, he was very often there, advising the king and his counselors what they should do and what they should not do. You never find Ezekiel doing that at all. Daniel did. Daniel was in with the kings, right? Darius and Cyrus and so forth. He was very much involved in the political, economic part, as was Jeremiah. But Ezekiel was just a lowly slave. And he wasn't interested in trying to teach the exiles about their political responsibilities and the right way to act in this situation and that situation. No, he was totally given over to the spiritual issues involved in God's judgment. Yes.
Did Ezekiel know Jeremiah?
Yes, he did. Yes. There is one chapter, I think it's chapter 19 or 29, I forget now, where Jeremiah wrote a letter to the exiles. And when Ezekiel found out about it or heard it, that actually became the source of some of it. It was used of God to cause him to predict the ultimate downfall of the city of Jerusalem. This is before it actually happened, about 5 years before. So yeah. What stimulated Jeremiah to write a letter to the exiles up in Babylon was that he had gotten word that some of them were saying, "Oh, we're only going to be here a couple of years." So Jeremiah wrote them a letter. I think it's chapter 29 of Jeremiah, which he wrote, and he said, "You're going to be there for 70 years." This is what God has said. He said, "You're going to be there a long time." And so when Ezekiel heard this, he corroborated what Jeremiah said. He said, "He's right." Okay. So they might not have known one another personally on a first-time basis, but they knew about one another. And I don't know if Ezekiel knew Daniel. There's one chapter here, I can just find it. when he mentions three of the great patriarchs of the land. By name. Boy, we should have done. Oh yes, he does. He must have known Dan, because he mentions him by name twice in chapter 14. One of Ezekiel's illustrations was, although these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in the city of Jerusalem, they should deliver only their own souls by their righteousness, God says. Verse 20, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, saith the Lord God, they shall deliver neither son nor daughter, they shall deliver only their own souls to their righteousness. Jerusalem was so bad in idolatry that God said, even if those three men lived there, the only people that would escape would be those three. Okay? And so Daniel was alive, and probably he had I haven't actually done this in my own, I haven't put a chronology down specifically between these prophets, but wasn't Daniel reading in Daniel chapter 9, I think he was reading Jeremiah's prophecy there of the 70 years. He was reading Jeremiah 29, Daniel was. And when he realized that the 7 years was just about up, then he got down on his knees, and that's when God gave him the vision or the special revelation of the 490 years of God's judgment on the nation Israel. This is that's Daniel 9. That's a special prophecy. One of the most famous Old Testament predictions. So that indicates that Daniel lived most of the way through, if not all the way through, that 70-year Babylonian captivity. And Daniel was taken out of the first deportation in 605. So he was a young man at that time. He was probably 11 or 12 or 13 when he was captivated. And he was still alive as a very old man at the end of the Babylonian captivity. And we know that that's the very time that Ezekiel lived, because Ezekiel was one of the captives living up in Babylon. So does that help put it together for you? Okay? And apparently they all knew one another, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Jeremiah. Okay? Jeremiah was the only one of the three prophets that was back in Judah. Okay. Jeremiah was probably the oldest of the three because he was contemporary with Isaiah, remember? And Isaiah lived much earlier when the northern tribes were captivated first, years before. And then Jeremiah was the one that was warning the kings of Judah that it was coming on them too. Right. Now, we've actually gone into this already. Your question has led us into the discussion of the personalities and the key events in the book of Ezekiel. I've already, in my introductory remarks on the authorship of the book, I mentioned a couple of historical events, but we'll just go through them briefly again. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar first captured Jerusalem. And he took Daniel and the temple loot back to Babylon. This is recorded in Daniel chapter 1. If you want other Old Testament records to this, Daniel chapter 1 and 2 Chronicles 36. What's the matter? Can't you write fast enough? You short parts.
I am. What's the reference for that?
Daniel 1. First chapter. And 2 Chronicles 36:10. And when the year was ended, King Nebuchadnezzar brought him to Babylon with the precious vessels of the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah his brother king over Judah and Jerusalem. Is that right? Yeah. That's the first deportation. It's also mentioned in 2 Kings 24. All right, the next major event is 597 BC. Jehoiakim rebelled. 2 Chronicles 36, verses 6 and 7. I'll read that verse. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. He also carried part of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon. I think I gave you the wrong reference. That looks backwards to me. Yeah, that should be the first one, and the other one I gave you is the second one. This is what happens when you're not prepared. Let me look at 2 Kings for a moment. All right, now 2 Kings chapter 24 talks about Nebuchadnezzar's first trip. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. It says, at that time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king and surrendered, basically. And he took from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king, the house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold that Solomon made. Carried away all Jerusalem, all the princes, all the mighty men, and left only the poorest sort of the people of the land. Now, it's coming back to me, right? There were more than 2 deportations. There were 3. The first time, he came up and just put Jerusalem under tribute. He said, okay, Jehoiakim, do your thing. Make me money. Right? When Jehoiakim rebelled, then he came back down, and the second deportation is when Ezekiel would have been captivated. In the first deportation, Daniel was captivated, and this country was put under tribute. In the second deportation, Ezekiel was captivated. That's 597, and the city was completely looted. I think it says in one place that there were 10,000 people taken captive at the second deportation of 597. 10,000. Okay? Then, in chapter 25, he talks about the third deportation, and this was when the city was destroyed. And I believe, if the date is right, it's 586. There were 3 deportations anyway.
605. But you didn't take any of the loot back.
Okay, 3 deportations. Anyway, 2 Kings 24 and 25 give you a better story than 2 Chronicles. Okay. Now, the book of Ezekiel opens up, as I just read to you, in the 30th year. He doesn't say what the 30th year refers to, but it says in the 4th month and the 5th day of the month, and then he gives you a benchmark as regards the captivity. He says that same time is the same thing as the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. Right? So we know that Jehoiakim was captivated the second deportation, which is 597. So Ezekiel began to prophesy 5 years later, in the 5th year of Jehoiakim. That subtract 5 from 597 and you get 593, actually, if you inclusive. So 593 is the year that Ezekiel began to prophesy up in Babylon. Right? Complex, eh?
What chapter is that?
That's Ezekiel 1, 1, and 2. That starts you off. Okay. Now, I'm not going to do this all for you because this is your project, but I'll read you the last one in the book that I can find. Chapter 40, verse 1. In the 25th year of our captivity. That means 20 years later after he began to prophesy. Because remember, he had been there for 5 years when he started. All with me? Okay. He was there for 5 years, from 597 to 583, 593. He was there 5 years before he began to prophesy. And then he says, in the 40th chapter, in the 25th year of our captivity, that means 20 years later, 22 if you include the first year and the second year. That's the way they did it. They were inclusive. In the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th day in the year after the city was smitten. That's even better. He tells you that it was 14 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. So now you can place the date of the destruction of Jerusalem on your timeline in relationship to the captivity. You follow?
586.
The best way to do this. Okay. 605, first deportation. All right, 597, the second. 583, the third. And then I think it was 3 years later in Jerusalem was Jerusalem was burned. I think. It was partially burned. Okay. Anyways, now this is where in 593, this is where Ezekiel starts, and he prophesies from in the 5th year. So 593. This is where Ezekiel starts prophesying, and he prophesies until the 25th year of the captivity. So 597 minus 25 is 572. So until 570, 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how, if you include these first and last years. We'll just make it 572. 25 years later, we have his last recorded Revelation. And he says that this point was 14 years after the final destruction of Jerusalem. It was destroyed by one of Nebuchadnezzar's generals just a couple of years after the third deportation, 2 Kings 25. 2 Kings 25. One of his generals burned the city, but he must not have destroyed it because it was 14 years. So add 14 years to 572, and you have 586. What does it say? In the 14th year after the city was smitten. Well, that could be referring to these dates could be out 3 or 4 years. It could be taking us back to this thing here. I'm not sure about that.
Where's two extra look like from between 235?
What?
Here, on the fourth, after 593, when you have two squiggles. I don't know what they're
25 years. Yes. Now, one fellow I was reading says that Ezekiel was called in his 30th year, so that reference to 30. The 30th year in Ezekiel 1:1 is probably how old he was. It says, now it came to pass in the 30th year, what could be taken as my 30th year. That is Ezekiel's 30th year.
I mean,
Well, that's what Locke here says. He was called in his 30th year. So if he was 30 years old when he began to prophesy, how old was he when he in his last prophecy? 25 years later. He was 55, so he wasn't all that old. We don't know what happened to him for sure. Okay. We know he was married up until the destruction, the very year that Jerusalem was destroyed. He had a happy home life. He had his own house. And the year just before Jerusalem was destroyed, his wife died suddenly. God predicted that his wife would die, and he was told not to mourn for her because God wanted that to be an illustration in his life of how Israel would respond to God's judgment. They wouldn't even mourn. It wouldn't even make any difference to them. Tradition says he was killed by fellow exiles because of his faithfulness and his boldness in denouncing their idolatry. This seems a little confused because I'm putting together 3 or 4 pages of notes here. Like Jeremiah, Ezekiel was both a prophet and a priest. Right? So Ezekiel is the key character in this book, and that gives you the main events in chronological order to this book. Now, as far as the geography to the book of Ezekiel goes, the book opens and closes with Ezekiel in captivity. The very first verse of Ezekiel says, "As I was among the captives by the river of Chebar,